Hey there, folks. My name is Syra, and I am a homeschooling, unschooling mom of and fostering mom of currently five. I have four biological kiddos, ranging in age from 4 to 18, and I currently have one foster placement. I have a little girl who is just under 1 year old. Um, I'm getting fancy now. I wish I could show you my setup, but I'm actually scared if I move too much, it'll all come crumbling down. I've kind of like put the selfie stick, uh, like I've shimmied it into place, so I'm hoping that it doesn't move. Um, and I took notes and I actually printed them out. So I have a little bit of focus for today's topic because I know I've been getting a lot of questions about um, how do we foster and work that around the biological kiddos that we currently have. So today I wanted to speak specifically about the question of what age should our biological kiddos be before we start fostering. And as all answers I give, I'm just going to say a big fat, it depends. Um, it depends on you. It depends on your temperament. Um, your spouse's temperament, and if you do better with the young ones or if you do better with older kids. It depends on your kiddos and how easygoing your kiddos are, or sorry, and what the temperament of your kiddos are. Some kids are very easygoing, and then there are some kids, particularly our kiddos that have a little bit of neurodivergence. Um, there are those kids that do well with routines and predictability, and they don't handle change as well. Not that you can't foster with kids who are neurodivergent. It just, all of this would just sort of depend on when you feel like it might be best to start fostering, or what age of foster kids you take into your house. Um, you know your kids, and you know the temperament of your kiddos. I remember, I have twins, and um, my twins are very different. I had one twin that if if nap time ever went over or was missed, they would rebound and bounce right back, um, and timing felt flexible and easy and fluid. And then I had another twin that really sort of fell apart every time there was a change in routine. So you know your kids, kids that are more fluid and flexible with their time tend to be more fluid and flexible with kiddos coming into the house. That being said, again, I can't reiterate this enough. It doesn't mean that if your kids are more resistant to change, that you can't foster. I have two kiddos that are very resistant to change and they need their routine, and two kiddos that are more fluid. Um, as they get older, that I really am speaking more about the younger kids. As they get older, I don't know if the kids that were more rigid with routine and resistant to change are the ones that did worse with the foster kiddo. So this really was more of an issue when the kids were little. I think there are different factors that come into play when kiddos are a little bit older. Um, okay, generally speaking, for me, um, babies that are babies, so essentially 0 to around the 12-month mark, those kiddos are really easy for me to add into a bunch. Um, and so when you're thinking about fostering, you have to think about it, and it's hard to predict ahead of time. And once you start fostering, you get a better sense of what your family's capacity is. But you have to sort of think about where in your life you would have room for a child who has a little bit more needs. Um, for us, babies have very physical needs. Um, so when you're looking at foster kiddos, now I've had one baby straight from the hospital. No, I've had two babies straight from the hospital. Um, One of those was in the hospital about 3 weeks, and she was a preemie. I've had a baby at around 3 months. I've had a baby at around 10 months. I had a baby for about from 6 weeks. So those are the majority of the kids that were placed with me as babies. I will tell you that what I saw with those babies is that, somebody asked me this question the other day. She said, do you feel like nurture shows up more or nature shows up more? And, I don't know if this is research backed. My gut, based on what I've experienced with these kiddos, plus the four of my own, um, most of my babies, whether they be foster or biological, they tend to have the same habits. They tend to have the same dispositions, generally speaking. Um, and I think that that's nature. No, I think that that's nurture. I think that I parented them the same way. I put them to bed in a similar way. I have a similar method of uh, feeding my kids and playing with my kids and nurturing my kids and how I show affection and all of those nurturing kinds of things, nurturing kinds of interactions that you have with babies. Um, I am essentially the same. So what I have noticed is that most of my kiddos, with some standard deviations here and there, most of my kiddos tend to sort of have the same disposition. So, generally speaking, I would describe most of my kiddos as being very easygoing, sleeping really well, feeding really well, um, transitioning well to solids, all of those kinds of things. Now, having said that, there were some standard deviations here and there. That's what I'll call it. Um, I've had some kiddos that were more prone to pretty severe diaper rash. And that is, again, something that you'll see with kids who are substance exposed in utero. They will have really severe diaper rash. It could be the result of their previous placement because not all of my babies came to me straight from the hospital. So there could have been a degree of negligence where they were coming from. I had one that was really prone to reflux. That was the preemie. She threw everything up. But even that, there was improvements made once she sort of came into the house. And she wasn't with us for very long, but once she was with us for a little bit, we kind of figured out how to feed her, like what worked better for her. It really wasn't terrible. But aside from those kind of those I don't want to use the word exceptional behaviors, but those types of things here and there, for the most part, generally speaking, I felt like all of my babies were the same, whether they were biological or foster kiddos. Even the foster kiddos that came substance exposed, they generally speaking, for the most part, were like my biological kiddos. Oh, I lost my train of thought. Anyways, I mention that because I know a lot of times people get scared when they hear about some of the circumstances where foster kids are coming from, and yes, these are children that generally speaking have more needs. And when we're having this conversation of what age your biological kiddos should be when you start fostering, I'm just trying to give you a sense of generally what I have seen or what you could see when you're fostering so that you have more of a sense of how much space you have in your life to manage these needs. Okay, so that's generally speaking 0 to 12. As kids sort of grow into like that toddler phase, what I have seen, whether I've really only had one toddler in my care, but beyond that one toddler, I've been around a lot of other foster families who have had kids in the toddler age. And generally speaking, you're looking at slightly more behavioral needs, possibly, but really more emotional needs that are showing up. And the way that it shows up is, they use that term Velcro toddlers. Actually, they say Velcro babies, but whatever. Toddlers that really need to just be with you a lot. The little girl that we had needed to be with me a lot. And for me, having a little one biologically, but also having a younger sibling of theirs, it was really difficult for me to manage that extra need of needing to be with me a lot, running to be in my lap when I was taking care of another kiddo in the house. That to me is a behavior that is not a big deal. I wouldn't even term that a behavior. I would say that that's reflective more of like an emotional need, an attachment need. But unfortunately, it was just one that was too taxing on me to be able to meet the needs of all the other kids in the house. So when you're thinking about your own biological kiddos, just remember that toddlers might cling to you a little bit more. And you just want to have space for that to happen. I think if I had just the younger sibling, or if I had a slightly older child, there was more of an age difference, or if I'm just completely honest, my little one is one of those kiddos that does need more routine in his life. He does need more predictability in his life. And he's not as fluid and as easygoing. When I think back to my older kiddos, there's one in particular who was very, very easy with their siblings. They were very easy to sort of help and be of assistance and sort of step aside, when there was another sibling who had needs. If that sibling was my now 4-year-old, I think that it probably would have been fine and we could have managed. But you have to kind of look at, again, who you are, what ages you do well with, who your kiddos are, what their needs are, and then, obviously the needs of the kiddos in your care, which unfortunately you can't always predict and you can't always know going in, which is kind of why I'm giving you an idea of what I've seen 0 to 12 and then in terms of like the toddler age range, so that you can try your best to kind of predict what kinds of space you would need in your household. Okay. I don't know if any of that made sense. When you have toddlers, remember that toddlers have tantrums. They're still learning how to communicate and they're not always able to fully communicate their needs. And so, their communication comes out in the form of tantrums. Again, it depends on you and your disposition and what your capacity is. I am somebody, babies and toddlers, no sweat. Like, that's kind of my ballpark. I do really well with that age range. Allah has just made it easy for me at that age range. So it just depends on you and your capacity. Even if it doesn't always make sense on paper, that might be your sweet spot. And so I would say try it out and go with it. Okay. Another thing to think about when you are dealing with toddlers, especially toddlers that are coming to you without you having been there for the baby phase. I want to sort of put an asterisk next to this point because how you were with your toddlers is very different than how you would be with somebody else's toddler. You might be the same and you might be very different. I remember when the little girl in our house was with us and and she was going through some challenging times. I remember my daughter turned to me, and my daughter is extremely nurturing. I mean, she is like heart of gold kind of nurturing. She's just like a rock star when it comes to her capacity to take care of babies. Um, and I remember she turned to me and she said something along the lines of, it's very different when you haven't had them from that baby phase, because she said, I sort of feel like Allah makes you super, super attached to the babies when they're a certain age. And then in that toddler phase, when they could be a little bit more challenging, let's say, um, it's a little harder because you haven't built that relationship with them yet. Um, Again, for some people, it's very easy to slip into that that spot. For others, it can be a little bit more challenging. So when she articulated that, I I had actually never really thought about it before, but I think that that's a valid point. That sometimes it can be difficult for people because you haven't had that time to build that relationship. On the other hand, um, people would argue that the same goes true for having school age kiddos. Like if you had those school age kiddos when they were in that toddler phase, where they're still pretty helpless and you're sort of guiding them towards, identifying their feelings, identifying their emotions, navigating how to process and handle and sit with those challenging big feelings. Sometimes it's easier when you've had them at that toddler phase for, fast forward into the future when you have them, at that school age. So all things to take into consideration, all different sides of a coin. Again, yourself, your kiddos, and you can kind of sort of start to architect when it might be the best for you to start fostering and at what age. Um, with toddlers, you 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 are going to run into potty training. You are going to run into some sleep issues. And also, one of the things that's a little bit different about foster kiddos than biological kiddos, generally speaking, is that a lot of times there will be food issues. If I haven't talked about food issues before, food issues show up with foster kiddos a lot. Um, you can find kiddos who will just never reach that point of satiation, whether they are feeding themselves from an emotional place, from some gaps in their attachment, or whether it comes from food insecurity and just a lack of knowing when their next meal is going to come from. Um, there's a lot of different reasons why food issues sort of come into place. We had a placement that came from another placement, and I sort of got the impression that that prior placement didn't know how to handle certain challenging things. And so as a result, it's really easy to get a baby to stop crying when you put a bottle in their mouth, even if they're not necessarily hungry. And perhaps there's like another need that's not being met. And so you might see a lot of that kind of thing show up with kids all the way down the line, whether, babies or all the way up. Um, Again, most of these issues are issues that you can work through, that you can help the child work through, but you have to have space to deal with those extra needs. Um, if you are a family where you've got a lot of kids and you've got a lot of things going on, um, you might not have space, like not physical space, but like that mental and emotional space to sort of um, leave room for these kiddos to kind of fill a space with the needs that they have. Um, we don't really have regrets. We don't really live our life with regrets. Everything kind of happens for a reason. Um, for me, ideally, if we'd had a set of bigs and those bigs moved up, and there was no smalls in the house, there were no littles in the house, to me, that's a really ideal time to start fostering. For me, from my vantage point. Others might have other experiences. I know a lot of families that they foster and those kids blend right in with their kiddos. Okay, let me preface this by saying I'm an older mom. I am 46. I am coming at this from the vantage point of somebody who leans a little more into her tired feelings. Okay, so let me just say this. There's a lot of foster parents in their 20s and 30s, but primarily there's a lot of foster parents in their 30s. Um, they're sort of already in the thick of it in terms of having little kids. And so they bring foster kids into their house, and those foster kids really blend right in with their biological kiddos. So maybe ignore everything I just said, quite possibly, if that more closely resembles your family demographic. That might be more close to your family demographic. If you're a little older or looking a little further ahead in terms of age and where you are positioned in terms of your family, then maybe take a little bit more to heart what I'm saying. Otherwise, take everything with a grain of salt. Okay, school age kids. If you decide that you want to take older kiddos, there's going to be different issues. But you're also going to have a lot more resources available because these kiddos, generally speaking, are going to school. There might be some behaviors like lying. That's very common. Those of us who have biological children, we know that lying is a common behavior amongst all kiddos. For foster kiddos or kiddos who have been in care and possibly in and out of care, those are two different scenarios. You might see lying as a coping mechanism, a means of safety. There's all kinds of emotional motivations towards lying. You could see it also show up in cases where there are perhaps some mental health issues potentially. I wouldn't jump that far necessarily right off the bat. But when you have lying, even amongst kids that don't experience huge amounts of trauma, all kids experience some degree of trauma, but perhaps not huge amounts of trauma or instability. Compulsive lying is sort of a cycle where, kids are kind of getting a dopamine rush every time they lie, and that can kind of become addictive. And so you might see that process. You might see that process with your biological kiddos. You might see that process with your foster kiddos as well. So I don't think it's something that's so out of the ordinary, but I'm just mentioning it in terms of behaviors that you might see. You might see more kinds of acting out and pushing of limits and testing of boundaries, and also testing to see how unconditional your love and affection is for them. It might be, there might be some habits that are created out of a sense of this is what we know gets us attention. This is what we know. This is what we've seen. We don't really even know any other way of being. There's lots of different reasons why you might see some behaviors. On the flip side, I have heard from foster parents and adoptive parents who have taken in older children that one of the benefit is that you can talk to kids. You can't really talk to babies. I mean, you can, you should, but you can't really reason with babies, nor can you really reason with toddlers, for the most part. And so with older kids, you do have that ability to sort of communicate more effectively with them, which is a plus. With older kids, you might find that you're doing more running around. But I'll be honest with you, even with my littles, I find that there's a lot of running around. Some people have said that there's actually more running around with the babies because there's more frequent doctor's appointments and things of that nature. Um, but just generally speaking, you want to have the ability to run around. Um, in one sense, that kind of worked out well for us because my older kids are they were in that phase of needing to be picked up and dropped off a lot. So we were running around already a lot for the older kiddos. And my younger one was young enough that he just kind of you know, ran along with me in the car. He just kind of sat with me. And the baby would go with me a lot of times. I'm so sorry. There is a lot of the law guys here. Um I'm hoping I learn how to edit and I can edit this part out. If I don't, I apologize. I'm using it as a drink break. Mm. I was just saying that it just happened to work out at this in this season of our life where I was able to run around a lot with the babies for all of their appointments and things that they needed. Um, because I didn't have tons of kids who had nowhere to go. Like if, you know, 5 years prior, 6 years prior, um, they would have been too young. Well, actually, they wouldn't have been too young, but you know what I'm saying. If they were elementary school age, if I was homeschooling them, they were too young to leave alone in the house. I would have had to bring them with me, and then it would have been just a zoo. It just would have been chaos. So, in that sense, the kids' ages worked out well for us. Generally speaking, um, you're going to need to give these kids time and you're going to need to give them attention. And you're going to want to be in a place in your life where um, you can do that. And your kiddos will be able to accommodate you giving that space to another child. Um, and again, it really is just down to a question of you looking at yourself, you looking at what your sweet spot is, what your strengths are, where your weaknesses lie, um, looking at your kiddos and seeing where they stand. I will tell you that if you are thinking about fostering, I would start having this conversation sooner rather than later with your biological kiddos. And I would also have a lot of very open conversation with them in terms of um, the social construct of fostering and some of the social implications of it. Just so that they have like a better bird's eye view impression of it, knowledge of it, and just so that they can start to wrap their brain around it. Um, but I think that's all I kind of wanted to say about what age your kiddos need to be. If you still have any more questions, as always, please feel free to put your questions in the comments or to send me a DM on Instagram. And I will always do my best to try to answer in whatever capacity that I can, even though I'm always forgetting things whenever I make these videos and I'm always feeling like I should have said this and I should have said that. But with that, I hope that you will like and comment and share these videos and try to spread the good wherever you can. And hopefully help me spread the good of this message so that we can get other people engaged in this forgotten sunnah of fostering and adopting.